"Ma'am, you can't come in like that," the hostess said, loud enough for half the room to hear, her voice cutting through the soft clink of silverware and low jazz playing overhead. And for a second, everything near the entrance seemed to slow as Angela Brooks paused just inside the glass doors, one hand still on the handle, the other gently supporting her baby against her chest, the cool air from outside still clinging to her skin as if it hadn't decided whether to let her go or pull her back out. She hadn't planned on stopping here, not really, but the baby had started fussing 2 blocks down, that soft, restless sound turning sharper with each step. And when she saw the warm amber lights spilling through the restaurant windows, the kind that made everything inside look safe and quiet and steady, she thought maybe just 10 minutes, just enough to sit, to feed him, to breathe. But now she stood there, caught between the polished marble floor beneath her worn sneakers and the sharp, assessing gaze of the young woman behind the host's stand, Emily Carter, who didn't smile, didn't soften, just tilted her head slightly, as if trying to place something she didn't like. Angela adjusted the small blanket around her baby, instinctively shielding him from the sudden tension in the air, her movements calm, deliberate, like she had practiced this kind of moment before, like she knew how quickly things could shift when eyes started lingering too long, when silence turned heavy instead of peaceful. A couple seated near the entrance glanced up, their conversation pausing mid-sentence, forks hovering, curiosity flickering into something quieter, something more uncomfortable, while a server passing by slowed just enough to notice, but not enough to get involved. And the music kept playing, steady and indifferent, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. Angela offered a small, polite nod, the kind that usually opened doors, softened edges, made space where there wasn't any, and said gently, "I just need a table for a few minutes." Her voice low, controlled, careful not to give anyone a reason to turn this into something bigger than it needed to be. But Emily's eyes dropped briefly to Angela's clothes, then to the baby, then back up again, and something in her expression tightened, not anger exactly, but a kind of practiced dismissal, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice to make itself clear. Angela felt it, that subtle shift, like the air had cooled a few degrees, like the warmth she saw from outside had stopped right at the threshold, and still, she didn't move, didn't retreat, just gently rocked the baby as his small fingers curled against her collar, his breathing uneven, searching for comfort. Somewhere deeper in the restaurant, laughter broke out, bright and easy, the kind of sound that belonged to people who never had to think twice about where they were welcome, and Angela's eyes flickered for just a second toward that sound, not longing, not quite, but something close enough to feel. Emily tapped something on the tablet in front of her, not really looking at it, more like creating a pause, stretching the moment just enough to make it uncomfortable, then said, still loud enough for others to hear, "We have standards here." And the words hung there, vague but pointed, like a line drawn without explanation, and Angela exhaled slowly, steadying herself, her thumb brushing lightly over the baby's back as if reminding both of them to stay grounded, to stay calm, because she knew how quickly things could spiral once someone decided you didn't belong. The glass door behind her closed with a soft click, sealing her inside the space but not quite letting her in, and for a brief second, reflected in the polished metal of a nearby stand, Angela caught her own image, tired eyes, determined posture. A mother holding her child like that alone should be enough reason to be treated with basic decency, and she lifted her chin just slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet insistence, as if she was giving the moment one more chance to turn, one more chance for someone to choose kindness over assumption. And that's when Emily leaned forward just a little, her tone sharpening as she prepared to say something that would change everything. Emily's lips parted just enough to let the next sentence land harder than the first, her voice still controlled but now edged with something colder, something that no longer pretended to be polite as she said, "We cannot seat you looking like that. It would make other guests uncomfortable." And the words did not echo loudly, but they spread quietly, slipping into the spaces between conversations, causing nearby tables to go still in that subtle way where people stop talking without wanting to seem like they are listening, while Angela remained exactly where she was, her posture steady, her arms secure around her baby whose soft, restless sounds had begun to rise again, tiny whimpers pressing against the tension in the air, like fragile glass tapping against stone. She did not respond immediately, not because she did not understand, but because she did, and understanding made it heavier, made it slower, made it something she had learned to move through carefully instead of reacting to all at once. Her eyes lowering briefly to the small face tucked against her chest, the baby's cheek warm against her skin, searching, trusting, unaware of the invisible line that had just been drawn between them and the rest of the room. Angela shifted her weight slightly, adjusting the diaper bag strap on her shoulder, her fingers brushing over the worn fabric as if grounding herself in something real, something that could not be taken away by a look or a sentence. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, measured, carrying just enough to reach Emily but not enough to invite the room in as she said, "I am not staying long. He just needs to eat." And there was no accusation in it, no challenge, just a simple truth offered gently, as if that alone should be enough. Emily let out a small breath through her nose, not quite a laugh, more like a dismissal wrapped in patience she did not actually feel, her hand tapping the edge of the host's stand again, faster this time, betraying a flicker of irritation as she glanced toward the dining room, then back at Angela, as if weighing the inconvenience against whatever quiet judgment she had already decided on, and somewhere behind her, a server paused mid-step, holding a tray just a second too long before continuing on, choosing movement over involvement. The baby's sounds grew sharper now, a soft cry breaking free, small but piercing, in the polished stillness of the restaurant, and Angela instinctively swayed, a gentle motion, almost like breathing, her hand moving in slow circles on his back, her lips brushing lightly against his hair as she whispered something too soft for anyone else to hear, a private reassurance in a space that no longer felt private at all. A man seated near the window shifted in his chair, his eyes flicking between Angela and Emily before settling back on his plate, though his fork no longer moved, while a woman across from him tightened her grip on her glass, her gaze lingering a moment longer before she looked away, and the room seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation, but in avoidance, as if everyone was silently agreeing not to interrupt whatever this was becoming. Emily straightened slightly, her shoulders squaring as if she had reached a decision she felt justified in, her tone firming as she said, "There is a place down the street that might be more suitable," and the word suitable hung there, stretched thin with implication, and Angela felt it, not as a sharp blow, but as something heavier, something that settled slowly into her chest, pressing against the calm she was holding on to, testing it, asking how long it could last. She lifted her gaze again, meeting Emily's eyes fully this time, not with anger, not with pleading, but with a quiet steadiness that did not shift, that did not shrink. And for a brief second, something uncertain flickered across Emily's expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by that practiced control, that certainty that she was on the right side of whatever line she believed in. Angela inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening just slightly around the soft fabric of the baby's blanket before relaxing again, her voice even softer now as she said, "He is hungry." And it was not a request, not exactly, but it carried something deeper, something human that did not need to be explained, yet the distance between them did not close, it only sharpened, becoming more visible with each passing second, and Emily's jaw set just enough to signal that whatever patience she had was running thin, her hand lifting slightly as if preparing to end the conversation altogether. And that was when the baby's cry broke through again, louder this time, cutting cleanly through the quiet room, drawing every eye back toward the doorway. And something in that sound shifted the weight of the moment just enough that it could not stay contained any longer. The cry did not sound loud by itself, but inside the carefully controlled quiet of the restaurant it carried in a way that made people shift in their seats, and Angela felt the small body in her arms tense, the baby's fingers curling tighter into her shirt as if searching for something that should have already been there, and she adjusted him again, closer this time, instinctively creating a shield between him and everything else that did not feel right, her hand moving in slow steady circles that matched her breathing, even though her chest felt tighter now, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of being watched, measured, and quietly dismissed all at once. Emily glanced toward the dining room again, clearly aware now that the attention she had been trying to control was beginning to slip beyond her reach. And there was a flicker of something sharper in her expression, a need to reassert order, to end the situation before it became something she could not manage, and she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to sound controlled, but not enough to hide the firmness behind it, as she said, "You are disturbing other guests." And this time the words were not framed as a suggestion, but as a conclusion already decided, already justified. Angela's eyes moved slowly across the room, not searching for help, not expecting it, but noticing the way people avoided holding her gaze for more than a second, how conversations resumed in uneven fragments, how a couple near the back leaned closer together as if shrinking the space around themselves. And she understood then that this moment had already been defined by everyone else, that she was no longer just a mother with a hungry child, but something else in their eyes, something inconvenient, something out of place. She looked back at Emily, her voice calm, almost softer than before as she said, "He is just a baby." And there was no defense in it, no raised edge, just a simple statement that felt like it should have been enough to reset everything, to remind anyone listening what actually mattered. But the air did not change, it only grew. More rigid, more fixed. Emily exhaled, her patience clearly thinning now, and her hand lifted slightly, gesturing toward the door behind Angela, as if guiding her out without physically moving. A controlled motion, practiced, one that carried authority without needing to escalate. And she said, "I am going to have to ask you to leave," the words delivered, with the kind of finality that left little room for negotiation. And for a moment, everything seemed to narrow to that single direction, that single expectation. Angela did not move right away, and the stillness of her refusal was subtle but unmistakable, her feet planted, her posture unchanged, her focus remaining entirely on the small life in her arms, whose cries had softened again into uneven breaths, tiny hiccups of sound that rose and fell against her shoulder, and she bent her head, slightly, pressing her cheek against his, a quiet grounding gesture that seemed to pull her back into something steady, something that no one in the room could take from her. A server passing by slowed again, this time just enough to glance at Emily with uncertainty before continuing on, and somewhere near the bar, a glass was set down a little too hard, the sound sharper than intended, breaking the fragile rhythm of the space. And Emily's jaw tightened at that, her composure holding but only just as if the situation was slipping further than she had planned. Angela's hand moved to the side of the diaper bag, unzipping it slowly, deliberately, the soft sound of the zipper cutting through the tension in a way that drew a few more eyes back toward her, and she reached inside, not hurried, not flustered, just focused, as if she had already decided something that no one else in the room understood yet. Emily watched her closely now, her posture shifting slightly, uncertainty beginning to mix with irritation, her voice sharper when she said, "Ma'am, you need to go now." But Angela did not respond to the urgency in that tone, did not mirror it, did not rise to it. Instead, pulling out a small bottle, checking it briefly, her movements calm, precise, entirely centered on the baby who quieted just a fraction at the familiar motion, his breathing evening out against her. The contrast hung there, visible, undeniable, one person pushing, the other steady, one trying to control the moment, the other refusing to let it control her. And for a second, something in the room shifted again, subtle but real, as if the balance of the scene was no longer as simple as it had been just moments ago. And Emily seemed to feel it too, her confidence flickering just slightly as she opened her mouth to speak again, but hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. The hesitation was brief, almost unnoticeable, but it changed something in the air, like a rhythm slipping half a beat off, and Angela did not rush to fill that space, did not look up immediately, just focused on the bottle in her hand, testing the temperature against her wrist with a practiced ease, her movements steady and familiar, the kind that came from long nights and quiet routines, and the baby responded to it, his small restless sounds softening, his body relaxing just slightly against her as if recognizing that something safe was coming, something certain. Emily watched this with a tightening expression, her authority meeting something it could not easily push against, something that did not react the way she expected, and for a moment she seemed unsure whether to interrupt or to wait, her fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the host's stand as she recalculated, her eyes flicking once more toward the room, where more people were now watching without pretending not to, their attention drawn not by noise, but by the stillness that had settled over the entrance. Angela shifted the baby gently, supporting his head as she brought the bottle closer, her voice barely above a whisper as she murmured something soft and rhythmic, a private reassurance that existed entirely outside the tension surrounding them. And when the baby latched onto the bottle, the small, quiet sound of it seemed louder than anything else in that moment, a simple, human act unfolding in a space that had made it feel complicated. The contrast was impossible to ignore now. The warmth of that small interaction against the cool, controlled distance Emily was trying to maintain, and it began to tilt the balance of the room in a way that no raised voice ever could. A woman seated near the entrance lowered her menu slowly, her eyes lingering openly now, not curious anymore, but thoughtful, while a man at the bar shifted his weight, his posture no longer relaxed, his gaze fixed on the scene as if something about it no longer sat right with him. Emily straightened again, drawing in a measured breath, her expression tightening into something firmer, more deliberate, as if she had decided that hesitation would only weaken her position, and she stepped slightly to the side, her voice sharper now, carrying more clearly as she said, "You cannot just stand here and do that," the words landing with more force than before, though still controlled, still framed as policy rather than personal judgment. Angela finally lifted her gaze, meeting Emily's eyes fully again, and there was something different in it now, not defiance, not anger, but a quiet clarity, as if she had settled into the moment instead of resisting it, as if she understood exactly what this was and chose not to let it define her response. And she did not raise her voice, did not argue, just said, "I am feeding my child." Each word simple, unembellished, grounded in something that did not need permission. Emily's lips pressed together, her composure holding, but the edges of it beginning to show strain, her glance shifting again toward the dining room where the attention had now fully settled. Conversations paused, movement slowed, the entire front section of the restaurant subtly orbiting around this quiet standoff, and that awareness seemed to push her further, her tone hardening as she took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to assert control, without crossing a line she knew she should not, and she said, "You are making a scene." But even as she said it, the words felt thinner, less certain, because the scene itself did not match the accusation. Angela did not respond immediately, her focus returning briefly to the baby, whose breathing had evened out, whose small hand rested lightly against her collarbone, fingers uncurling in slow, trusting movements, and she adjusted the blanket around him with a gentle precision, her actions speaking louder than anything she could say, grounding the moment in something undeniable. A faint sound came from somewhere behind Emily, the subtle creak of a door opening toward the back of the restaurant, unnoticed by most, but enough to shift the air just slightly, as if something else was about to enter the space, something that would change the direction of what was unfolding, and Emily, still focused on holding her position, did not notice it yet. The faint creak behind the host's stand grew just loud enough to register, a soft shift in the rhythm of the room that did not belong to the quiet tension at the entrance, and Angela felt it before she saw anything, not as a sound exactly, but as a change in the way the space held itself, like something unseen had stepped into the frame, altering the balance in a way that could not be ignored for long. She did not turn immediately, her attention still centered on the baby whose breathing had settled into a slow, steady pattern. His small fingers now loosely curled against her, his body relaxed in a way that suggested trust, complete and unquestioned. And she adjusted the bottle slightly, ensuring he was comfortable, ensuring that this moment, at least for him, remained untouched by everything else unfolding around them. Emily, still fixed in her position, did not notice the shift right away, her focus locked on maintaining control of the situation she believed was slipping, her posture rigid, her expression firm in that practiced way that tried to hold authority together even as the edges began to fray, and she crossed her arms lightly, not aggressively, but in a way that closed her off, reinforcing the boundary she had already drawn. The room, however, had begun to lean in a different direction, subtle but undeniable, as more eyes lingered without pretense, as the earlier avoidance gave way to quiet attention, the kind that carried judgment not just of what was happening, but of how it was being handled, and a man near the bar shifted his stance again, his gaze moving from Angela to Emily and back, slower this time, more deliberate. From behind the host's stand, a figure moved into view, partially obscured at first by the angle, the soft overhead lighting catching only the outline of a dark suit and the steady, unhurried pace of someone who was not reacting, but assessing, and though no words were spoken, the presence alone carried a weight that began to ripple outward, changing the way the space felt in small, almost imperceptible ways. Angela sensed it now more clearly, her eyes lifting slightly, not turning fully, but enough to acknowledge that something had entered the moment, something different from the tension she had been holding against, and she remained still, her calm unchanged, her focus steady, as if she understood that whatever was coming did not require her to shift first. Emily, finally catching the movement in her peripheral vision, glanced over her shoulder briefly. Just a quick check, but it was enough for her expression to flicker, just for a second, a crack in the certainty she had been holding on to, and though she turned back almost immediately, something in her posture adjusted, almost imperceptibly, like a thread had been pulled loose. "You need to leave now," she said again, but the words did not land the same way this time. The firmness still there, but the confidence slightly thinner, stretched by whatever she had just noticed behind her, and the room seemed to feel it too. The earlier tension shifting into something quieter, more watchful, like a held breath waiting for direction. Angela did not respond to the repeated demand, did not acknowledge the urgency in it, her attention returning fully to the baby as she lowered the bottle slightly, checking his face, brushing her thumb gently along his cheek, a small, instinctive motion that carried more care than anything else in the room, and for a moment, that simple gesture became the center of the scene, grounding it in something undeniably human. The figure behind Emily stepped closer now, fully visible to those watching, though still just outside Angela's direct line of sight, his presence calm, composed, not hurried, and he paused for a brief second, taking in the situation without interruption, his gaze moving from Angela to the baby, then to Emily, not with immediate judgment, but with a measured awareness that suggested he understood more than what was being said out loud. Emily straightened again, as if sensing the scrutiny, her chin lifting slightly, her voice attempting to regain its earlier control as she added, "This is private property," but the words felt rehearsed now, less grounded, as if they were being spoken to reinforce something that was already beginning to slip. The baby shifted gently in Angela's arms, his small hand moving again, resting softly against her neck, and she closed her eyes for just a fraction of a second, a quiet pause, a breath, before opening them again, steady, composed, unchanged, even as the space around her continued to shift, and just as Emily prepared to speak again, the man behind her finally took one more step forward. The shift was subtle but unmistakable as the man stepped fully into view, his shoes making no sound against the polished floor, yet somehow drawing every eye in the room. And he did not rush, did not interrupt, just stood there for a brief moment behind the host stand, his presence settling into the space like a quiet weight that changed the way people held themselves. Emily turned halfway toward him, her expression tightening as recognition flickered across her face, quick but sharp, and though she straightened immediately, something in her posture lost its earlier certainty, her shoulders no longer as firm, her stance no longer as anchored as it had been just seconds before. The man's gaze moved calmly across the scene, not scanning, not searching, but absorbing, taking in Angela first, then the baby resting against her, then the bottle in her hand, and finally settling on Emily with a steadiness that did not need to raise its voice to be felt. And when he spoke, it was low, controlled, carrying just enough to reach those closest without disturbing the rest of the room as he said, "What is going on here?" Not as a demand, but as a question that expected clarity. Emily reacted quickly, almost too quickly, stepping slightly toward him as if to regain control of the narrative before it slipped further, her voice composed but tighter now as she said, "She is refusing to leave and causing a disturbance." And the words came out smoothly, practiced, but there was a faint strain beneath them, a need to justify rather than simply state. The man did not respond immediately, his eyes shifting briefly back to Angela, who had not moved, who still stood with the same calm presence, the same steady focus on her child, and in that moment the contrast spoke louder than any explanation could, the quiet care in her movements, the absence of escalation, the stillness that had held even as everything around her pressed against it. Angela finally looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation, not defensive, not pleading, just present, and for a brief second there was a recognition in that exchange, something unspoken that passed between them, subtle but real, before she lowered her eyes again to adjust the blanket around the baby. Ensuring he remained comfortable, undisturbed, the man took a small step forward, positioning himself just slightly closer to Angela than to Emily, not dramatically, not in a way that called attention, but enough to shift the balance of the space, and he asked, still calm, still measured, did she ask for a table? And the question landed differently, more precise, more grounded in the actual moment rather than the version being presented. Emily hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and in that pause the room seemed to lean in again, the silence stretching thin as she responded. She said she only needed a few minutes, her voice softer now, the edges of it less certain, and the man nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he already understood. He turned his attention fully to Angela then, his tone gentler, but still clear as he said, "Ma'am, are you okay?" And the simplicity of the question cut through everything else, not about policy, not about disruption, just about her. And Angela held his gaze for a moment, her expression steady, her voice quiet as she answered, "My baby just needed to eat." And again, there was no accusation, no added weight, just the truth placed calmly into the space between them. The man exhaled slowly, a subtle release, his posture shifting just slightly, as if something inside the situation had settled into place, and he glanced briefly around the room, taking in the watching eyes, the paused conversations, the quiet tension that had built and held, before returning his attention to Emily, whose composure now felt thinner, more fragile, her earlier certainty replaced by something closer to unease. A server near the entrance stopped completely now, no longer pretending to pass by, her attention fixed openly on what was unfolding, while a couple at a nearby table exchanged a quick look, something unspoken passing between them. The man's voice remained even as he said, "There is no disturbance here." Not raised, not forceful, but final in a way that did not require emphasis, and the words seemed to settle into the room, shifting it once more, pulling it away from the version that had been building towards something else. Emily's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, to correct, to regain ground, but no words came immediately, and in that silence, her earlier authority felt distant, replaced by something uncertain, something that had not been part of her plan. Angela adjusted her hold on the baby again, her movements unchanged, her calm intact, as if none of this had altered what mattered most in that moment. And the man watched her for a second longer before turning back to Emily, his expression now more focused, more direct, as if he was about to say something that would not leave room for interpretation. Emily swallowed before she could stop herself, the movement small but visible, and for the first time since the moment began, she did not immediately speak. Her usual quick responses replaced by a pause that stretched just long enough to feel unfamiliar, and the man did not rush to fill it, did not repeat himself, just held her in that quiet expectation, his gaze steady, unblinking, as if he was giving her the chance to choose carefully what came next. The room seemed to lean into that silence. Again, not tense in the same way as before, but attentive, like something important had shifted, and everyone could feel it without needing to name it. And Angela remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her focus still anchored in the small, steady rhythm of the baby feeding, the soft sound grounding everything in a way that no raised voice ever could. Emily finally straightened her shoulders, drawing in a controlled breath, her composure attempting to rebuild itself piece by piece as she said, "We have policies," her tone measured, but no longer as firm, the words sounding more like something she was reaching for rather than something she fully stood on, and she added, We cannot allow people to just walk in and use the space without being seated properly. And though the explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, it did not land the same way it might have minutes earlier. Not after what had already been seen, not after the quiet contrast that had settled into the room. The man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way he stood, a slight narrowing of his focus that suggested he was no longer evaluating the situation, but the explanation itself. And when Emily finished, he let a brief silence follow, not dismissive, but deliberate, as if giving her words the full weight they deserved before responding. Angela adjusted the bottle slightly, her fingers gentle, precise, her attention still centered on the baby, whose breathing had now evened into a calm, steady pattern, his small hand resting lightly against her skin, and for a moment, that quiet connection seemed to exist entirely separate from the conversation happening around them, a reminder of what the moment actually was beneath everything else. The man finally spoke again, his voice even, but more direct now as he said, "Policies do not override basic decency." And the sentence did not rise, did not sharpen, but it carried a weight that settled into the space more heavily than anything that had been said before, and a faint shift moved through the room, subtle but collective, like something unspoken had just been acknowledged out loud. Emily's expression tightened again, but differently this time, not with authority, but with something closer to uncertainty, her eyes flicking briefly toward the guests who were now openly watching, no longer pretending to be uninvolved, and then back to the man, as if trying to find solid ground again. "I was just doing my job," she said, quieter now, the words less certain, and there was a small defensive edge to them, but it did not carry the same confidence as before, and the man nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition of the statement itself, before responding, "Your job is to represent this place." And he gestured lightly around them, not dramatically, just enough to include the room, the people, the atmosphere that had been carefully built. And right now, this is what people are seeing. And the simplicity of that observation seemed to land harder than any accusation could have. A soft murmur passed through a nearby table, quickly hushed, but noticeable, and Emily felt it, her posture shifting again, the edges of her control continuing to loosen as the moment moved further beyond what she could manage alone. Angela lifted her eyes briefly, watching the exchange without interrupting, her expression calm, almost distant, as if she had stepped slightly outside the tension, observing it rather than being consumed by it. And then she lowered her gaze again to the baby, adjusting the blanket once more, her movements unchanged, consistent, grounding. The man's attention remained on Emily, his voice steady as he added, "There was a better way to handle this." And the words were not harsh, not condemning, but they carried a quiet finality, a line drawn not in anger, but in clarity. And for a moment, Emily seemed to search for something to say in response, something to hold on to, but nothing came immediately, her earlier certainty replaced now by hesitation that lingered just a little too long. The air felt different now, not tense in the same way, but heavier, more defined, as if the moment had crossed into something that could not easily be undone. And the man shifted his weight slightly, his posture settling into a decision that had not yet been spoken, his gaze steady, his expression composed, and Emily could see it before he said anything at all. Emily saw it before it was spoken, the shift settling fully into the man's posture, into the way his shoulders aligned and his gaze steadied, no longer weighing possibilities but arriving at something decided, and that realization moved through her like a quiet drop in temperature, subtle but undeniable, and for the first time since the moment began, she did not look at Angela, did not look at the baby. Her focus locked entirely on him, searching for something in his expression that might soften what was coming. The room seemed to hold still again, not out of tension this time, but anticipation, the kind that builds when a moment reaches the edge of change, and even the soft background music felt distant, like it belonged somewhere else, somewhere untouched by what was unfolding near the entrance. Angela remained grounded in her quiet rhythm, the bottle steady in her hand, the baby calm now, his small breaths even, his body relaxed completely against her as if nothing beyond her arms existed, and she adjusted the blanket once more, her movements slow and careful, shielding him not from noise, but from something deeper, something unseen but felt. The man took a measured breath, not heavy, not dramatic, just enough to mark the transition between observation and action, and when he spoke, his voice was still calm, still controlled, but there was no space left for interpretation as he said, "Emily, step aside for a moment." And the use of her name landed differently. Personal now, direct, carrying a quiet authority that did not need to rise in volume to be understood. Emily blinked once, caught off guard by the shift, and for a fraction of a second she did not move, her body holding on to its previous stance as if it had not yet received the message. But the weight of his tone lingered, pressing gently but firmly, and she stepped back, just one step, not far, but enough to change her position, enough to move from the center of the moment to its edge. A subtle ripple passed through the nearby tables, the smallest shift of posture, the faintest release of breath, as if something long held was beginning to loosen, and the man stepped forward into the space she had vacated, placing himself between the host's stand and Angela, not as a barrier, but as a bridge, his presence now directly aligned with hers. He glanced briefly at the baby, his expression softening just slightly, not in a way that drew attention, but enough to be felt, and then he looked at Angela, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that held respect rather than assumption, and he said, "Please, take a seat." The words simple, offered without hesitation, without condition. Angela did not move immediately, not out of resistance, but out of careful consideration, her eyes searching his face for a moment, reading something there that she had not seen before in this space, something consistent, something real, and she nodded once, a small, quiet acknowledgement, before shifting her weight, slightly as if preparing to follow the invitation. Behind him, Emily stood still, her hands now resting at her sides, her earlier composure replaced by something more uncertain, her gaze fixed on the interaction unfolding without her control, and for a moment, she seemed smaller, not physically, but in the way her presence no longer shaped the room. The man turned his head slightly, addressing a nearby server with a calm, even tone. "Could you prepare a table near the back, somewhere quiet?" And the server responded immediately, nodding, her earlier hesitation gone, replaced by a clear sense of direction, and she moved quickly but smoothly, her steps purposeful as she went to arrange the space. Angela adjusted her hold on the baby, lifting him slightly as she shifted the diaper bag more securely on her shoulder, her movements still composed, still unhurried, and as she took her first step forward, the room seemed to follow her with a quiet awareness, not intrusive, not heavy, but present, acknowledging the shift that had just taken place. Emily's gaze dropped briefly, her eyes tracing the polished floor for a second before lifting again, and there was something different there now, something unsettled, as if she was beginning to see the moment from a distance she had not allowed before, and she opened her mouth slightly, as if to say something, to reclaim a part of what had slipped. But the words did not come. The man remained where he was for a second longer, watching Angela move past him, his posture relaxed now, the decision fully made, the tension no longer resting on his shoulders. And then he turned slowly back toward Emily, his expression no longer questioning, no longer assessing, but settled into something that carried a different kind of weight, something that would not be as easily redirected. And Emily felt it before he spoke again. Angela moved slowly through the restaurant, guided by the quiet direction of the server ahead of her, her steps measured not out of hesitation but intention, each one grounded, steady, as if she refused to let the moment rush her into anything less than composed. And the baby remained calm against her, the earlier tension gone from his small body, replaced by a gentle stillness that mirrored her own, his breathing soft, and even as he continued feeding, unaware of the shift that had just taken place around him, the warm lighting that had once felt distant now settled over her as she passed deeper into the room, casting a softer glow across her face, across the small curve of the baby's cheek, and for a moment, it felt like the space was finally aligning with what it had promised from the outside, quiet, safe, steady. Behind her, near the entrance, the air had not yet settled in the same way, and Emily remained where she had stepped back, her posture still, her hands now loosely clasped in front of her, no longer directing, no longer controlling, just present in a way that felt unfamiliar, and the man stood a few feet away, his attention fixed on her, not harsh, not raised, but firm in a way that left no room for avoidance. The surrounding tables had not returned fully to their conversations, their attention still anchored at the front, drawn to what was about to unfold next. And a faint murmur passed through the room, quickly quieted, as if everyone understood that something more important than dinner was happening. Emily shifted her weight slightly, her eyes dropping for a brief second before lifting again, meeting the man's gaze. And there was something different in her expression now, not defensive in the same way, not dismissive, but unsettled, as if the certainty she had relied on had begun to unravel. In ways she had not expected, the man did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make it clear that this was not a conversation to be rushed, and when he finally did, his voice was calm, even, but carried a weight that felt heavier than anything he had said before as he asked, "Do you understand what just happened?" And the question was simple, but it did not ask for explanation. It asked for reflection. Emily blinked once, her lips parting slightly, but no immediate answer came, and the pause itself spoke volumes, stretching just long enough to reveal that whatever she had thought moments ago no longer fit as easily. And she glanced briefly toward the direction Angela had gone, her eyes catching just a glimpse of her being seated, of the baby still resting peacefully in her arms, and something in that image seemed to linger, pressing quietly against whatever she had been holding on to. "I was trying to follow procedure," she said finally, her voice softer now, lacking the earlier edge, and though the words were familiar, they did not carry the same certainty, sounding more like something she was repeating than something she fully believed in this moment. The man nodded slightly, acknowledging the response without affirming it, and he took a small step closer, not invading her space, but narrowing the distance enough to make the conversation more personal, more direct, and he said, "Procedure should never erase humanity." The words, landing with a quiet finality that did not need emphasis, and Emily's gaze dropped again, her shoulders shifting as if the weight of that statement had settled somewhere deeper than she expected. Across the room, Angela adjusted the baby gently as she reached the table, the server pulling out a chair for her, her movements still calm, still deliberate, untouched by the conversation unfolding behind her. And as she sat, the soft sound of the chair against the floor marked a quiet transition, a movement forward that did not look back. The room began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, conversations resuming in low tones, though the awareness of what had just occurred still lingered, woven into the atmosphere in a way that would not disappear quickly. Back at the entrance, Emily remained still, her earlier composure now replaced by something more reflective, her eyes lifting again to meet the man's, and for the first time, there was no attempt to defend, no immediate explanation, just a quiet recognition that something had gone wrong in a way she could not easily undo. The man watched her for a moment longer, his expression steady, his posture composed, and there was a pause, a brief, quiet space where everything seemed to hold again, not in tension, but in transition, as if the next words would not just respond to the moment, but define what came after it, and Emily could feel it before he spoke. The silence stretched just long enough to settle into something irreversible, and when the man finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet clarity that did not need volume to be understood as he said, "Emily, this is not about procedure anymore." And the words landed with a finality that shifted the ground beneath her in a way she could feel, but not immediately respond to, her breath catching slightly as she held his gaze, searching for something that might soften what was coming next. He did not look away, did not hesitate, his posture steady, composed, and he continued, "This is about judgment, and the way you chose to treat someone who did nothing wrong." And there was no accusation in his tone, no raised edge, just a calm truth placed directly between them, leaving no space for reinterpretation. Emily's fingers tightened slightly against each other, her hands still held in front of her, and for the first time since the moment began, she seemed unsure of where to place them, unsure of how to stand, her usual control slipping in small, visible ways as she glanced again toward the dining room, her eyes catching the subtle movement of guests who were no longer pretending not to notice, their awareness now fully present, quietly observing the outcome of what had unfolded. Across the room, Angela sat at the table near the back, the soft glow of the overhead light settling around her, and she adjusted the baby gently as she lowered the bottle, checking his face with a small, careful motion, her thumb brushing lightly along his cheek, grounding herself in that simple act, as if everything else had already passed, as if the moment at the entrance no longer needed her attention. The contrast between that quiet scene and the stillness at the front only made the weight of the conversation heavier, more defined, and the man took a slow breath before speaking again, his voice even, but carrying a different kind of firmness now as he said, "I cannot have someone representing this place who forgets what respect looks like." And the sentence settled into the air with a quiet permanence that could not be walked back. Emily's lips parted, a reflex, as if to respond, to explain, to reach for something that might shift the direction of what was happening. But no words came immediately, and the pause itself revealed more than anything she could have said. Her earlier certainty now replaced by something closer to realization, something that had arrived too late to change what had already been done. A faint sound of movement came from a nearby table as someone adjusted their chair, the small noise echoing softly in the space that had gone quiet again, and Emily swallowed, her gaze dropping briefly before lifting once more, her voice softer now, almost careful as she said, "I did not mean for it to go this far." And the sentence lingered there, not as a defense, but as an acknowledgement that the moment had moved beyond her control. The man nodded slightly, not dismissing her words, but not allowing them to shift the reality of the situation either, and he stepped just a fraction closer, his presence calm but unyielding as he replied, "Intent does not undo impact." And the simplicity of that statement seemed to settle deeper than anything else, grounding the moment in something that did not depend on interpretation. Emily's shoulders lowered just slightly, the tension in them releasing into something heavier, something quieter, and for a brief second, she looked toward Angela again, really looked this time, not as an interruption, not as a problem to solve, but as a person sitting quietly with her child, and that image held there, steady and undeniable, reflecting back something she had not seen before. The room around them had begun to return to its rhythm, conversations resuming in low, cautious tones, the clink of silverware reappearing softly, but the awareness of what had happened remained, woven into the space in a way that would not disappear quickly, and the man straightened slightly, his decision now fully formed, his expression composed, and he said, "I am going to need you to step away from your position." The words delivered without hesitation, without anger, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, a small, controlled pause, before opening them again. Her expression changed, not resistant, not defensive, but quieter, as if something inside her had finally settled into place, and she nodded once, slowly. The movement small but final, her hands lowering to her sides as she took a step back, no longer holding onto the role she had stood in just moments before. The man watched her for a second longer, ensuring the shift was real, ensuring the moment had fully turned, and then his attention moved briefly toward the dining room, toward Angela seated calmly with her child, before returning to Emily, his voice softer now, but still steady as he added, "We will talk about what comes next." And the words did not carry threat, only consequence, and Emily felt the weight of them settle in as she stood there, no longer at the center of the room, but not yet ready to leave it either. The space at the entrance felt different now, not tense, not controlled, but unsettled in a quieter way, like something had been broken without noise, and Emily stood there no longer anchored to the host's stand, her role slipping from her in a way that left her unsure where to place herself, her hands resting loosely at her sides, as if waiting for direction that had not yet come. The man did not rush her away, did not gesture for her to leave immediately, just allowed the moment to breathe, to settle into its new shape. And then he turned his attention briefly toward the dining room again, his gaze landing on Angela, who remained seated at the table, calm, composed, her world reduced to the gentle rhythm of caring for her child, and something in that contrast seemed to guide his next decision. He stepped away from Emily then, not dismissing her, but shifting focus, and moved slowly toward the back of the restaurant, his pace measured, unhurried, as if this part of the moment required a different kind of attention, one that was not about correction, but acknowledgement. Angela noticed him approaching, not immediately, but in the way one senses movement in a room that has grown quiet around them, and she lifted her eyes slightly, meeting his gaze as he stopped a respectful distance from the table, his posture open, his expression softer now, the earlier firmness replaced by something more human, more present. "I am sorry for what happened at the entrance," he said, his voice low, sincere, not rehearsed, and the words were simple, but they carried weight because they did not try to explain, did not try to soften. They just stood there as they were. Angela held his gaze for a moment, her expression steady, thoughtful, and she did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of consideration, as if she was measuring the moment not by what had been said, but by what it meant, and she glanced briefly down at the baby, whose small hand had curled loosely against her shirt, his breathing calm, unaffected by everything that had come before, and that quiet presence seemed to guide her response. "He just needed to eat," she said softly, the same words as before, but now they carried something different, not explanation, not defense, but closure, as if she was choosing to leave the moment where it belonged instead of carrying it forward. The man nodded, a small acknowledgement, and there was a brief silence that followed, not uncomfortable, but complete, like something had reached its natural end without needing to be pushed further. Around them, the restaurant had fully returned to its rhythm now. The clink of silverware, the low hum of conversation, the soft movement of servers passing between tables, all continuing as if nothing had happened, and yet the awareness lingered, woven quietly into the atmosphere, present in the occasional glance, in the subtle shifts of posture, in the way people seemed just a little more attentive than before. Angela adjusted the baby gently, lifting him slightly as she checked his face, her thumb brushing softly along his cheek again, a small, grounding gesture that brought her fully back into the moment she had chosen to focus on, and she reached for the napkin on the table, unfolding it carefully, placing it within reach, her movements steady, unhurried, untouched by anything beyond that space. The man remained there for a second longer, as if considering whether anything else needed to be said, but he seemed to understand that this was not a moment that required more words, and he gave a small nod before stepping back, allowing her space, allowing the quiet dignity of the moment to remain intact without interruption. Across the room, near the entrance, Emily still stood where she had been left, her posture slightly shifted now, less rigid, more uncertain, her gaze occasionally drifting toward the back where Angela sat, and each time it did, something in her expression changed, subtle but real, as if she was beginning to see the moment from a distance she had not allowed herself before. A server passed by her, offering a brief, neutral glance, not unkind, but different, and Emily felt it, the shift in how she was being seen, the quiet change in the room that no longer centered around her authority, and she took a small step to the side, moving away from the host stand completely now, her position no longer tied to it. Back at the table, Angela leaned slightly closer to the baby, her voice barely above a whisper as she murmured something soft, something only he would hear, and the baby responded with a small, content movement, his fingers uncurling again, resting gently against her skin, and in that quiet exchange, the weight of everything that had happened seemed to fade into something distant, something already passing. The man reached the entrance again, his steps slowing as he approached Emily, his expression composed, his posture steady, and though he did not speak immediately, the direction of the moment was clear, and Emily felt it before any words were said, standing there in the quiet space where everything had changed, waiting for what came next. The distance between them felt smaller now, not because either of them had moved closer, but because the moment itself had narrowed, focusing everything into a quiet space that no longer needed to be filled with raised voices or rigid posture. And when the man stopped in front of Emily again, his presence was no longer about authority alone, but about something steadier, something that carried both consequence and intention. Emily lifted her eyes to meet his, and there was no resistance left. There, no attempt to hold on to what had already slipped away, only a quiet awareness that had settled into her expression, the kind that comes when a moment has already taught its lesson before anyone explains it. He did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to sit between them, not as pressure, but as space. And Emily seemed to understand that, her shoulders lowering slightly, her breath evening out as if she had finally stopped bracing for something and started listening instead. "You will not continue your shift today," he said calmly, his voice even, without sharpness, without emphasis, but the words carried weight because they were clear, because they did not leave room for misunderstanding. And Emily nodded almost immediately, the movement small, controlled, her acceptance quiet but complete. She did not argue, did not explain, did not reach for anything to hold on to. And that absence of resistance spoke more than any defense could have, as if something inside her had already acknowledged what the moment required. A server passed behind them, moving carefully, respectfully, as if aware that this conversation carried more than just instruction. And the soft sounds of the restaurant continued around them, the rhythm now fully restored, yet still carrying a faint echo of what had shifted. Emily's gaze drifted briefly toward the back of the room again, toward Angela, who remained seated, calm, steady, her attention still centered entirely on her child. And there was something in that image that held her there for a second longer than before, something that no longer felt distant or separate, but closer, more real, as if she was finally seeing it without the filter she had used earlier. "I understand," Emily said quietly, her voice softer than it had been at any point before, not rehearsed, not defensive, just simple. And the man studied her for a moment, not questioning, not doubting, but ensuring that the understanding was genuine, that it had settled in the right place. He gave a slight nod, acknowledging her response, and then added, "We will discuss next steps later," his tone steady, leaving the future open but grounded in the present. And Emily accepted that as well, her posture shifting just enough to reflect that she was no longer standing in the same role she had held minutes ago. She took a small step back, not away from him, but away from the space she had occupied, creating distance between herself and the host's stand. And for a moment, she stood there, not moving further, as if adjusting to the absence of something that had defined her position, her authority, her certainty. Across the room, Angela reached for a glass of water that had been placed gently at her table, lifting it carefully with one hand while still supporting the baby with the other, her movements fluid, practiced, and she took a small sip before setting it back down, her focus never leaving the quiet rhythm she had chosen to remain in. The man glanced in her direction once more, not lingering, just acknowledging that the moment had settled where it needed to, and then returned his attention to Emily, his expression now neutral, composed, no longer carrying the weight of decision, only the steadiness of what had already been done. Emily shifted again, her hands moving slightly as if unsure where to rest, before settling at her sides, and she drew in a slow breath, her eyes lowering briefly before lifting again, not to him this time, but toward the room itself, taking in the space from a different perspective, one she had not held before. The people, the tables, the quiet conversations, all continued as they had, but something about it felt altered, not in appearance, but in meaning, as if the same room now held a different understanding, one she had only just begun to see. The man stepped aside slightly, not dismissing her, but giving her space to move, and Emily hesitated for just a second before turning, her steps slow, measured, not hurried, as she began to walk away from the entrance, away from the position she had stood in. And though no one stopped her, no one spoke, the quiet awareness of the room followed her in a way that did not feel heavy, but present. She passed by a table near the front, her gaze briefly catching her reflection in the polished surface of a glass. And for a moment, she paused just slightly, not stopping completely, but enough to notice, enough to see herself differently than she had when the moment began. And then she continued, her steps steady, moving toward the back hallway, toward whatever came next, leaving behind a space that no longer belonged to her in the same way it had before. And the man watched her go for a second, his expression unchanged, before turning back toward the entrance, the room now settled, the moment complete, though its impact had only just begun to unfold. The restaurant had settled back into its rhythm, but something in the air remained softer, more aware, like a quiet echo that did not fade but instead reshaped how everything felt. And Angela sat there in that warm pocket of light near the back, her world small and complete, centered on the gentle rise and fall of her baby's breathing, the soft movement of his fingers against her skin, and the steady calm she had carried with her from the moment she stepped inside. She adjusted the bottle one last time before easing it away, watching as he drifted into that quiet, satisfied stillness. His body relaxed fully now, his trust unbroken, and she smiled, not broadly, not for anyone else to see, but in that small, private way that belongs only to moments like this. A server approached quietly, placing a small dish and a folded napkin on the table with care, her movements respectful, unintrusive, and she offered a gentle nod before stepping away, as if understanding that this space did not need interruption, only presence. Angela reached for the napkin, dabbing lightly at the corner of the baby's mouth, her touch careful, familiar, and then she leaned back slightly in her chair, letting out a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding, her shoulders lowering as the weight of everything that had happened finally loosened its grip. Across the room, conversations flowed again, laughter returned in soft bursts, glasses clinked lightly against tabletops. And yet there was a subtle difference in the way people glanced up now and then, a quiet recognition, a shared awareness that something meaningful had passed through this space and left its mark. Near the entrance, the man stood for a moment longer, his posture relaxed now, his expression no longer carrying the firmness of decision, but something quieter, reflective, and he glanced once more toward Angela, not to check, not to confirm, but simply to acknowledge, before turning back to his responsibilities, moving through the restaurant with a calm that seemed to match the atmosphere he had helped restore. In the hallway beyond, Emily paused just before the corner, her hand resting lightly against the wall as she stopped for a second, the noise of the dining room now distant behind her, and she closed her eyes briefly, not in frustration, not in resistance, but in reflection, as if replaying the moment not to defend it, but to understand it. And when she opened them again, there was something quieter there, something that had not been present before, a recognition that settled slowly, deeply, without needing to be named. She straightened, her breath steadying, and continued down the hallway, her steps measured, no longer rushed, no longer driven by the need to control what was in front of her, but guided by something else, something she had only just begun to grasp. Back at the table, Angela shifted slightly, adjusting the baby against her shoulder, her hand resting gently along his back as she looked out across the room, not searching, not questioning, just present. And for a moment, her eyes caught the reflection of the warm lights in the window, the soft glow blending with the night outside, and it felt like a quiet boundary between what had been and what was now. She reached for her glass again, taking a small sip, the cool water grounding her fully in the moment, and she set it down carefully, her fingers lingering on the edge of the table for a second before pulling back, her movements unhurried, intentional. Nothing about her posture suggested victory, nothing about her expression asked for acknowledgement, and yet the room itself seemed to hold a quiet respect for her, not loud, not spoken, but present in the way people moved, in the way the space had adjusted around her without her ever needing to demand it. The baby stirred slightly, a small movement, and Angela responded instantly, her hand shifting to comfort him, her voice a soft whisper meant only for him. And he settled again, the rhythm continuing, unchanged, undisturbed. The moment that had begun at the door had not followed her here. It had ended there, left behind without needing to be carried forward, and what remained was something quieter, something stronger, something that did not need to prove itself to anyone. The lights overhead cast a steady glow across the table, across her hands, across the small, peaceful face, resting against her, and the world around her moved on, not because it had forgotten, but because it had learned just enough to continue differently, even if only in small ways. And in that quiet, steady space, nothing more needed to be said.